Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's episode 37 of The Pick List. Have you had a good week?
Hello Laura, yes, a very good week, thank you. I'm off deadline, hurrah, which means I've had some time to pop down to Long Benton and take a look at the new Swift store that's just opened. We talked about this on last week's episode, it was just about to open then. I've had a look at it, really interesting. I was very interested to see what they've done in terms of merchandising chilled and frozen products side by side. So some of the themes that we talked about on the podcast last week certainly feel like they have been implemented there. Really impressive. What have you been up to?
I'm excited you've been, and I'm excited it's in the Northeast as well. I have been to my first face-to-face business meeting in 6 months yesterday, which was an absolute treat. And as much as I'm a fan of Zoom, it was amazing to get out and see a CEO of a meat processor, one of the PLCs. And it's great just to be in the room and chatting about business, which is it's so much easier when you're face-to-face, and also a mean bacon and egg sandwich, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
That sounds like a good deal to me.
Great deal, worth a trip. We have got a brilliant guest this week, haven't we?
Yes, we have. We're joined by Chris Dee. Chris was formerly CEO of Booths and Director of Food and Home at Harrods, and now he's a startup founder and entrepreneur, including at maltreleaseradar.com, which is a business that focuses on rare whiskies. On top of that, he's also an advisor and non-exec chairman to a wide range of businesses. Chris has so much knowledge, experience, expertise around food retail, so it was fascinating to get his take on what's happening in the market and, of course, see what he's reading at the moment.
We loved it. Just before we start the show, a reminder, we're on Instagram, the Picklist Podcast, so please do like and share some of our posts. It's great to get your feedback on the show. Let's start.
Chris, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Now, I don't think there'll be many listeners who don't know who you are, but for the one or two who've been living behind a rock, why don't you tell us who you are and how you're connected to the food and drink industry?
Okay, so I'm Chris Dee. I'm actually now an online startup founder, entrepreneur in the world of collectible whiskey. So a departure from quite a lot of what I've done during my career. But basically at the moment building a couple of different businesses online. One is a community driven around whiskey, all about alerting consumers to new releases, and the other is a platform for people to be able to trade those bottles when they get them. Alongside that, I also act as an advisor and non-exec chairman to a number of challenger brands in the FMCG space and a couple of retailers as well. And then probably better known for being a former shopkeeper. Most recently was Food and Home Director at Harrods, and before that, Chief Exec at Booths.
Now, before we jump into your article choices, we do want to quiz you a little bit about what you've seen in the past 12 months, because it's just been such an extraordinary time for food and drink and for retail in general. What do you think are the most significant changes that are going to shape and change the way grocery retail operates permanently? The stuff that isn't just a short-term change in response to COVID, but will have moved the needle permanently.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, start out with all the obvious stuff around the channel shifts and the habits that we appear to have seen change amongst consumers, and I think that inevitably that's going to play out over the years to come. I'm a great believer that habits stick, and I do think therefore that broadly my view is that an awful lot of what we've seen change will be permanent change. So I don't think we'll go back in many areas. And I think therefore, and it's been interesting because part of my background recently has been around hospitality as well as retail. And I think the hospitality industry has obviously gone through a massive shock, but has actually quite interestingly responded entrepreneurially and found new ways through. And I think a lot of the additional incremental business that hospitality has seen through meal kits or through online ordering or whatever it is, through Deliveroo, etc., I think a lot of that will stick. And I think that's going to be genuine incremental business for restaurants who will continue to have people come. The bit that will come back is customers coming back into their restaurants. But if you think about the frequency at which you visit a normal restaurant, even your favorite restaurant, I bet you don't go more than once or twice a year. Whereas, as a grocer, I'm used to people coming back in every few days. So I think any additional business that you can get on top of that once or twice a year visit will be genuinely incremental. So I think hospitality will come out of this actually a different industry. It's obviously going to be smaller, but it's going to be vibrant, and I think we'll continue to see all the innovation and the sort of entrepreneurial spirit that we've seen come out in this last 12 months. I think food retail obviously has had a very buoyant year if you take mainstream grocery, and it's interesting to see. I know how it looks, how it feels when you're staring into a sea of red rather than a sea of green, which they'll all start to now appreciate, given that this time last year we were just entering lockdown 1 and all the panic buying and everything else that was going on. There will have to be some responses, and clearly not all of that at home consumption and purchase will continue, and there will be some meal replacement going back into hospitality. So that's going to be interesting as to certainly the mainstream grocery industry and how it responds and what innovations it brings to try and deal with that. Because let's face it, on one level they've had it easy for a year, and I think it's going to be a much more challenging year coming forward. Having said that, those who have adapted to much more of an online presence and have managed to build capacity quickly, and broadly the big four have, I think that will serve them well, and I think that online channel will continue to perform very well. And I'm assuming that some of the speciality trade that's also been built alongside that will continue to perform well. When I was at Harrods, some of the things I did before I left were around building partnerships with hospitality, with Deliveroo and with Supper in central London, but also we put Harrods into Ocado for the first time as well, with a view to the future, not just for COVID, but for a long-term partnership, which hopefully will pay off. So I think that channel shift is here to stay. I can't see it all drifting back. I think if anything, offline shopping in supermarket environment will be the bit that then struggles a little. Whether we see any main shift from big store to small store, whether we see continued discounted growth versus premium, I don't know, and I think that's all to play for, really.
Fantastic. And we'll actually get an opportunity to dive into some of what you've talked about in a little bit more detail when we talk about your articles as well. The pick list, of course, is all about highlighting interesting articles about food and drinks. So we do want to quiz you a little bit on your reading habits as well. How do you keep up to date with what's happening in the industry? What publications do you read on a regular basis?
So the honest answer is I don't. I think I only read one offline publication at all now, which is the Weekend FT, which I get on a Saturday, but it does last me all weekend. And I don't buy a paper. I don't subscribe to any magazines. I don't buy anything really. I consume huge amounts of news, but it's all through feeds of various sorts, whether that's LinkedIn, whether that's Apple News, whether it's Twitter. It's just coming at me all the time. I definitely enjoy a number of different newsletters and sort of the curated news, I suppose, in various forms. Also, it's worth saying that I am probably more fascinated these days by Silicon Valley and everything tech than I am necessarily everything food or retail. But I, traditionally would have been much more food and retail only. But tech news is quite important to me now as well. So it's kind of it's a bit of shifting sands in terms of what I actually read.
Excellent. All right. Tell us about your first article pick for us.
So my first article is a pretty straightforward news article from Sky News, which the headline's Cadbury owner Mondelez takes a £200 million bite of healthy snack maker Grenade. And it's the story of Cadbury's acquisition of Grenade, which was obviously announced this week. And I suppose it fascinated me for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, the number 200 million, which is fascinating in itself, because it's a significantly higher number than I think a lot of people would have assumed that business would sell for. I mean, certainly their last set of accounts, they were making a profit of 5 million off a turnover of 50. So it's a 40 times multiple of profit, 4 times multiple of sales. Those are significant. Now, to be fair, I think there's a story behind that, which is probably around their 2020 and how 2020 has gone for them. And I'm assuming that it's gone quite well. And Grenade, for everybody who possibly doesn't know the business that well, is primarily driven by protein, and it's protein bars and shakes and energy drinks, so sort of sports nutrition. And it's a brand which I think is fascinating because it's it grew by stealth for a long time. I don't think it was mainstream at all. For a long time, its biggest channel was actually Amazon, not even just its own online D2C. It was all about Amazon. And then it suddenly sort of appeared on everybody's shelves as well, and suddenly become a big thing. It's one of those overnight successes, which was 20 years in the making, but actually, has sort of crept up on us. And I suppose it's fascinating that they've chosen this moment to sell. I mean, they've had various moments in the past where they've had investment from private equity, so it's private equity backed Line Capital. I think back in 2017. Equally fascinating is the fact it's Mondelez. Mondelez's last acquisition in the UK was Cadbury's, which was in 2009, 2010, probably the very year that Grenade started was the last time Cadbury's went into the market with M&A. So that Mondelez went into the market for M&A. So it's an interesting story of big food, global food giant buying small British challenger brand, and interestingly, we've seen it in the last couple of years quite a few times now. PepsiCo buying Piper's Crisps. We've seen Barilla buying Pasta Evangelists recently, Nestle buying Mindful Chef. We've got this sort of pattern of British startup challenger being acquired by global food businesses. So I think it's interesting. I think also from a consumer and behavioural perspective, if Grenade have had a great year, it's partly on the back of exercise trends and health and leisure within the home. It's partly because they were well placed to sell on subscription and to sell and to create impulse in the home. So it's a category, it's a brand that you kind of associate with an impulse category, and impulse has obviously had a difficult year. And I think for Grenade, clearly their channel strategy has finally paid off. It's kind of almost like, reluctant to say, but COVID was made for them. It was something that they would always benefit in this period. So for all those reasons, I just think it's a really interesting story.
I thought it was fascinating, and I couldn't wait to get your take on it, Chris, because I thought I wonder what your thoughts are. And I guess when I read it, I thought a couple of things. That is the FMCG market always going to consolidate? Is it always the case? When you set up one of these brands, is it the dream? 20 years down the line, you'll get a sale for 250 million because it sounds amazing. And then the flip side of that is, the likes of Mondelez and Cadbury's, does it allow them to play more in the D2C space? We've seen them doing more of this, but as you say, that's where Grenade started. Does that allow them to, I guess, trial new tech with a ready-made market when they're traditionally in a retail arena? Do you think it'll flex their, excuse the pun, their muscle in a different space?
I think so. I think it works both ways for them as well, because if you think about it, Grenade probably hasn't got the full distribution it deserves in mainstream grocery, and clearly Mondelez can, despite the fact it will, there'll be lots of talk of it remaining independent and not part of, you can imagine that at some point in the future, Mondelez account manager will be representing both Grenade and Cadbury's. So, and actually, if you go way back in time, Green and Blacks was the first example of this, and that was a Cadbury acquisition in its day, and ultimately it benefited from that mainstream grocery distribution. So I think there's a positive synergy from having a big player partner who's got the relationships and clearly in the right categories to a certain extent as well. But I also agree. I think D2C is becoming more important for mainstream big FMCG, and they need to understand it, and the best way of understanding it is to acquire it.
I also think it's a real vote of confidence for the protein trend, because, that made such waves a few years ago, and it feels like it's been overshadowed a little bit more recently. We've obviously heard a lot about plant-based protein, but that sort of core protein product, it feels like that, NPD and just general attention has sort of diminished a little bit. I think a really sizable deal like this, and particularly a big player like Cadbury, like Mondelez getting involved here, shows that there's clearly loads of potential left and loads of room for growth left as well in pushing these products further into the mainstream.
I think the interesting one is the low sugar dimension as well, because they definitely trade off low sugar. And I think low sugar is an increasingly important element alongside protein. So it's how do you, it's the carb element as much as the protein element. So whilst it is very pro protein, it's also very low carb, and it's driving both at the same time.
Julia, what's your first pick this week?
My first pick this week is from the FT, and it's an article titled "Change of Menu, Kraft Heinz Bets on Old Brands to Win New Consumers." This continues the theme a little bit around big brands, big multinationals looking to reinvent themselves, and it's about a significant change in strategy for Kraft Heinz. To date, their strategy has been to use big acquisitions, big ticket M&A as a way to drive growth and transformation. If you think back to their attempt to buy Unilever 4 years ago, that was essentially that strategy taken to its logical conclusion, if you will. Now they want to change tack and they want to focus on organic growth. And instead of buying in that growth, buying in that transformation through M&A, they say they want to change their products, their brands, their company, and find new growth that way. So it's a big change in direction, and it's a big job for Miguel Patricio, who's the Kraft Heinz CEO. He's quoted in this article, and he talks about, of course, how this is a change in direction that was very closely coordinated with 3G, the key investor in Kraft Heinz as well. So what does this new organic growth strategy look like? In essence, they're going to try and do a much better job of going after some of the consumer trends we've already touched on. So health, more natural ingredients, functional ingredients, sustainability, those big trends that everyone in FMCG talks about all the time, but which Heinz has sort of dabbled in, but hasn't really cracked yet at scale. And again, I suppose the obvious comparison here is Unilever once again, but also Nestle. Companies that are really investing in those areas, that talk a lot about their commitment to making healthy changes, their commitments to sustainability. They've invested in plant-based, etc., etc., etc. So there's quite a bit of catching up to do for Kraft Heinz in these areas, and it sounds like that's where they will be focusing a lot of their efforts. Patricio talks about making products cleaner and greener, which about sums up what this new strategy is all about. More generally, they are also upping budgets for research and development and for marketing. Those budgets have been slashed previously as part of cost-cutting measures, but they are now being increased again. And Kraft Heinz is able to do all this because it's in a better position now than it has been for a while. It's had a good pandemic. Sales did well. It's also recently sold off some brands, which means it's been able to pay off some of its debt, and there's just generally more breathing space here to try new ideas and a different approach. But as the article points out, of course, there will be quite a few grocery brands that have had a good pandemic, and they will all be looking to now hold on to those new customers and maintain some of that growth into 2021 and beyond. So competition will be intense. There will be a lot of brands upping their marketing and advertising spend. And so I think it's going to be fascinating to see, what we can expect in terms of actual NPD, new marketing, new messaging coming out of Kraft Heinz as a result of this new strategy. But also, who of the big grocery brands will ultimately succeed in maintaining some of that extraordinary growth that we've seen over the past 12 months? Who will actually manage to hold on to some of these new customers that they've acquired over the past year? Chris, what did you make of it?
First of all, I think it's a great article. I mean, it's actually quite a long article. There's quite a lot in it, and it's really informative. I mean, I've followed the 3G story for many years, and I think there's some interesting dilemmas that they're facing. And I think it's primarily because 3G as a private equity investor have come, their background is in essence AB InBev, so it's the beer industry. And they went through the beer industry like a dose of salts in terms of making acquisition after acquisition after acquisition. Lots of both family businesses and private businesses that they were able to buy in and transform. And they transform them in a very sort of formulaic way. So 3G are very driven by meritocracy, in the sense that they give young, hardworking, dynamic people in their business lots of leadership and autonomy at an early stage in their careers, and very, very good at promoting quickly, and heavily incentivize their teams to deliver growth. They're very keen to simplify everything and make it as easy as possible to make change, and use simplicity as a strong and important tenet. And then there is this sort of obsession with cost cutting. And I think that cost cutting is what's actually served them badly with Kraft Heinz. And I think wonderfully, George Lehman, their chief exec, talks about costs are like toenails; they need constantly clipping. So it's just that sort of notion that they just see it in such a way. And I think this is a great example of you can't cut your way to greatness. This is a business. Unlike the beer industry, by the way, and I think I think food is different to drinks in this. Beer is primarily there's a couple of usage. There's obviously occasions around which one might sell beer and market beer, but actually you then simply have the tiering around good, better, best, and in principle, each beer falls into one of those buckets, and then here's a program, here's your marketing plan, go off and do it, and by the way, here's how you could cut your production costs. It's a relatively easy business to deliver. Food is not like that, and I think across lots of different categories, and Kraft Heinz has multi-category presence. It's just more complicated, and it takes a much more of a surgeon's knife approach. And I think that the big danger in cost cutting in a lot of food businesses is that you basically cut to mix my metaphors, you cut the hand that feeds you. And you miss the opportunity to invest, particularly around marketing, and particularly about those costs which genuinely differentiate you in the market. It sounds like all that's about to change, and it sounds like they're back on the right track. And certainly strategically, it made loads of sense to me to be doing the things they're doing. And we've seen little examples of it. I don't know whether you saw the Heinz tomato ketchup advertising during lockdown around the billboards and people drawing their own ketchup bottles, and how the fact that always turned out to be Heinz, really clever and brilliantly executed in social media, etc. So I think they're on their way back. I just think that it's a sign of a PE house sort of culturally driving the wrong outcomes, because of the history of the category that they've grown up in.
Laura, what's your first pick for us?
My first pick this week is from the Sunday Times, and it's a piece by James Timpson, and I think this is my second pick of James Timpson over the history of the pick list, so I'm sorry about that, but I just love his pieces, and this one's entitled Meet My Secret Weapon, a Director of Happiness. And as you know, I'm a big fan of a CEO think piece, because you always get a couple of nuggets about, how the business operates that you wouldn't normally see, and James's pieces are normally pretty authentic, and this one I would book it as such. So he talks a little bit about the business, and they've got just over 2,000 stores, which is a bit bigger than I anticipated actually. And he talks about how their business trends. When it's raining, sales go up. Of course they do, because you want to get your shoes repaired. And when it's the sun's shining, shoe repairs go down because they don't repair flip-flops, which I really like that comment. And I thought, yeah, I didn't really think about that. And then when the kids go back to school, their key cutting business goes through the roof, and business is busy. He then goes on to talk about how he keeps a strong commercial eye on sales. Of course he does, but 90% of the time when sales are dropping in a certain store, that's actually down to the colleague that's running that store, and it's normally a problem away from work. And Timpson's try and step in and try to help. And this is how the article then goes on to talk about this director of happiness, who talks about the potential about being a backlog of issues due to the COVID, and the importance of a caring culture for an organisation, and what he's trying to embed in his organisation. So every Monday he gets a confidential list of colleagues of concern, which I thought was fascinating, and they're grouped into 3 areas: mental health, physical health, or money problems. And then he goes on to say they tackle these issues through 3 secret weapons, and this was a particular bit I really liked. And these 3 secret weapons are Elaine, Marion and Janet. And I just liked how it was so humanised, because normally from a big corporate you would say, we've got this department and this department, but he talks in first name terms. Elaine's a counsellor, Marion's a financial health specialist, and Janet is the said director of happiness. She helps colleagues that are in crisis to get support, and that can be anything from the example in the article, for helping a colleague with a funeral and clearing his mum's house, through to a colleague that's just come out of prison. And Timpsons are quite renowned for recruiting folks that have recently come out of prison, and James Timpson's a big ambassador in that space. He then goes on to talk about care for people on the payroll is essential, and profits will follow. And I just really like this whole caring culture, because I think sometimes we think they aren't mutually exclusive, to be focusing on profit and caring for your people. And I guess the other thing I just wanted to mention within this, I was chatting to a CEO of a meat processor yesterday, and he was telling me they're a big PLC, and that they'd offered a financial scheme to their employees coming out of COVID, and did they need any extra financial support. And he said about 15% of his huge workforce were taking that up, and how important it was for organisations to step into a space that they probably wouldn't historically do. What are your thoughts, and will this become more important over time?
Well, so first of all, just a massive fan of James Timpson and his father and Timpson's as a business, and so many lessons in that business to learn from. I always loved the quote that they only had 2 rules: is look the part and keep your hands out of the till. I just thought for a retailer that was just about all you probably do need if you're going to pare it right back down. And again, a business that gives great autonomy and works on some fairly simple. I suspect, if I'm honest, that James doesn't get many more reports on a weekly basis than the ones he mentions in the article. It's run on a sort of minimal basis, and he doesn't believe in centralizing anything. It all happens in the stores, and he's out in the stores all week. So, as you say, everything he said is almost certainly authentic and genuinely what he does care about. And he comes from a very caring family and has got a whole approach. Look, I'm a massive supporter. I'd never heard of these it described in the way that he has, but if I go back in time and think about how that might have worked in the various businesses I've been in, I think it absolutely plays out. I think interestingly, financial health does cause issues, and for a lot of employees who are often on minimum wage or close to minimum wage in retail, it's a genuine struggle, and finding ways of helping them is part of the organization's challenge. I think it's hugely important. I think it's interesting that you can take the view that it's, it is well-being and happiness, and that if you put employees first, ultimately they're the ones that want to serve customers, and happy, healthy, undistracted teams of people who want to work together and want to serve customers well are always going to make great service colleagues. And so from a retailer's point of view, it feels very natural. I think it's really interesting how that plays out in a production facility, and how that is in a very different environment where you might not necessarily have to put on a brave face every day in quite the same way, but equally the impact you have on your fellow colleagues can be quite high. So I think there is a contrast. If you're customer facing, it's one thing. If you're not, how does that work? And I'm making the assumption that it's just equally important, but for different reasons.
I was also really interested to read about this concept of a director of happiness, because I think it starts to move us away from crisis response when it comes to mental health and well-being, and to more preventative approaches. So I feel like the debate and general awareness around mental health has improved dramatically, and the idea that companies, that employers should offer assistance and be supportive when someone has a mental health crisis or a problem, I think is fairly well established now. But there still seems to be that gap that when it comes to physical health, of course we have a subsidised gym membership. Of course, if I'm getting RSI strain, I get a different mouse from the IT department. It's no big thing. There's a sort of understanding that maintaining good physical health is definitely something that an employer should help employees with as well. I don't see that quite yet playing out with a mental health and mental well-being approach, and I'd be really interested to see what that might look like, where you're not just jumping into action the minute there's someone in crisis, but you're actually thinking about how you can contribute to good mental health and well-being on an ongoing basis.
And I agree, and I think that preventative piece is definitely missing, and this is the first time I've heard of it done in this way, and I think it sounds like a great way to deliver it. It has to be said, when I was at Harrods, the occupational health support that is in place at Harrods has a very strong mental health dimension to it. And I think actually increasingly there are teams out there and businesses that take it very seriously and invest a great deal in. Although I would say that is still relatively crisis based, but it's definitely there. So I'm sure it's happening across the space.
Chris, tell us about your second pick for us.
So my second pick's from the Guardian, and the headline is simply "Meet the New Breed of Work from Home Chefs." So this is an article which picks up on a stat from the Food Standards Agency, which is 40% of all new ventures in the last 12 months that have been registered with the FSA are basically based in domestic kitchens, which is an extraordinary stat in itself and really fascinating. And then the article really goes on to talk about the fact that quite a lot of businesses are now obviously starting in domestic kitchens, and there are a number of different platforms that have been built as marketplaces for them. And then also that it literally goes on to describe 3 of those specific businesses, and goes into a great deal of depth. I mean, I was interested in just the notion of it, and it's really interesting because this cropped up at home the other day, and my wife mentioned to me, oh, there's all these businesses that have been started in kitchens, and I was, outraged initially. How, what about HACCP? What about the technical? What about the food safety culture, which is so obviously important in any manufacturing situation? How could this possibly be? And it was great to read, actually, that there's been some genuinely pragmatic support given to make sure that the food that they're selling is safe, and clearly that matters enormously, but also that you've got these incredibly entrepreneurial, driven individuals, often from chef backgrounds, but not always, just finding wonderful gaps in the market, like super premium luxury kebabs as one of the producers, which sounded amazing, I have to say, and the fact that they're finding ways of reaching direct to consumers primarily through social channels, but also through these new evolving marketplaces. The marketplaces themselves, the platforms, were were quite sort of localized. So I think there was one in Bristol, there was one in Watford, there was one in Northampton. These weren't just all central London or big city marketplaces. And I love the whole notion of these sort of side hustles that are going on, where people are having to do a day job as well as make food and then sell it. And again, goes back to this sort of spirit of entrepreneurialism that's come out of a mixture of hospitality and food production during COVID. And I just thought it was, again, quite an uplifting article about food entrepreneurs finding a way through.
I felt the same about what about HACCP? That was my first first thought. But what about food safety? And then my second thought was, I guess over the years, retailers have followed food service for trends, haven't they? And you do a street food safari to check out what was happening in central London, and then bring those trends into supermarkets the following year or so through MPD. And I thought, is this potentially the new street food? We've talked about street food for so long, but now, as you say, these amazing entrepreneurs finding categories and flavours that probably you wouldn't be able to find elsewhere could actually build brands and influence retail in the long term as well, maybe.
And there's again, going back to sort of some of the startup culture in Silicon Valley, there's this whole notion of do things that don't scale and make something that people want as two really strong tenets, which is make something that people want is try out lots of different things until you get to the thing that they want, and then make that. Don't think that you know best. And domestic kitchen is by far the very best way of experimenting with finding out what people want. If you can, you could change your menu every week and realize ultimately that they're actually what the people really want is this. And likewise, doing things that don't scale is all about just saying, accepting to begin with that you're constrained with your production. You can only do so many, but you find 100 people that love you, and then find a way of scaling it. And scaling it could be a street food van, it could be a small industrial unit, it could be it could be a shared kitchen somewhere, it could be a dark kitchen somewhere. There are obvious steps from domestic kitchen upwards. So my view is that it's going to be a hotbed. To your point, Laura, it's going to be a hotbed of new MPD, and who knows what will come out of it.
I'm so interested in your perspective as someone who advises and invests in startups as well. This idea that, don't do things that scale, but I suppose there will be a lot of people who've started a side hustle who at some point do want to sort of scale and do want to see whether they're ready to take things to another level and perhaps bring someone like you on board. When you are looking at startups, whether it's in hospitality or it's in food retail, what do you look for to determine whether this is a business that's perfect for the home kitchen and should stay at that, or whether it's ready to take that next step?
I mean, I think everything's about traction. So if you can demonstrate, and it doesn't have to be sales traction, it can be literally Instagram followers, it can be anything. If you can show that you've attracted a growing number of fans of some sort in some way, preferably by selling them things that they like, that they want to come back for, and preferably that they're engaging with the product and they're sharing it with friends and there's word of mouth, there's all those elements. I just think that is so much more a sign of potential success. The things that are already on a roll, even if it's at a relatively early stage, I think are obvious candidates for investment. Clearly, the individuals concerned also make a huge difference. So if I was going to look for two things, it would be a business or a product or an idea that has already demonstrated real genuine traction, and I can see a chart that's going like that. It's almost irrelevant what it is, and then alongside that is someone who is cockroach-like in their ability to survive. Resilience is everything for entrepreneurs. They need to keep going and show me that you've kept going despite everything. And that's someone, it's not about having come out of big organizations. It's not about necessarily having worked in small organizations. It's not necessarily about being financially astute or commercially astute or a great marketeer or a great, person on camera or any of those things. It's about show me that you can survive.
Julia, what's your second pick this week?
My second pick this week is from Gizmodo, and it's an article titled "This Mars Bar Rover Will Chase You Around a Store and Tempt You to Buy Candy." Now, if you're into your retail tech, or you're into confectionery brands or retail tech used by confectionery brands, then you will know about this already, because news of this was announced about a month ago. I didn't see it at the time, and when it was picked up by Gizmodo this week, I thought, this is absolutely fascinating and I need to talk to you both about it. So here we go. Basically, what we're looking at is an autonomous robot called Smiley, developed by Mars Wrigley, which is currently being trialled in the US with ShopRite, the retailer. Currently in one store, but with the potential for more, of course, if these trials prove successful. Smiley looks like a little caddy, and it's loaded with Mars products. So in the video shown in the article, it's M&Ms, Skittles, Snickers, as well as gum products like Orbit. And it basically whizzes around the shop floor. And if a shopper gets within 4 feet of this little caddy, it starts trying to sell you stuff. So there are sounds and notices on its display to engage shoppers and, of course, ultimately get them to put some of these products into their baskets. It also uses some really clever sensors to detect people and objects and motion, so it's able to navigate around stores safely and without bumping into other fixtures or shoppers. All of this is part of Mars's efforts to better understand the potential of robotics in retail, but also to explore what's going to happen with impulse purchases in the future. And Chris mentioned this early on. Impulse buying, of course, has had a particularly tough time during COVID, so there's a lot of interest in looking at how you can reinvigorate some of these categories. Now, I think this particular approach is fascinating and disturbing at the same time, and it raises so many questions for me, not least because you do wonder whether shoppers are going to be happy to be stalked like this on their shopping trips. I can't quite get my head around the shopper benefit here quite yet. I can certainly see why this would appeal to a brand owner. But what am I getting out of this as a shopper, other than potentially being tempted to impulse buy products that I was perhaps trying very hard to avoid whilst wandering the aisles? And I do think perhaps part of my caution here is because this happens to be a trial run by a confectionery company, and these caddies are, in this particular instance, offering, by and large, confectionery products. You know, if this were a little robot stacked with fruit and veg, reminding everyone to get their 5 a day, then perhaps I'd feel a little bit differently about this. So is it the fact here that this is tempting shoppers to buy something that's quote unquote unhealthy, that's the issue here? And certainly, I think based on the discussions we're having in this country about obesity and what's happened with guilt lanes in stores, you would think that it'd be pretty difficult to do something like this in the UK at the moment. Chris, what did you make of it? And could you see something like this ever working in a UK supermarket?
I only have 3 words to say. I hate robots. I can't imagine any worse thing than what they've invented. I mean, it's just, total gimmick. Can't imagine it will get beyond the 1 store trial. Technology for technology's sake, all the things that you would absolutely not want as a retailer. It's disruptive for customer journeys. It's sort of like weird reversal of pester power. It's kind of like, here's a robot that's going to pester you to buy something from it. All wrong. Not customer centric. Very brand centric, as you say. I don't think there's any shopper benefits at all. And they would obviously not have been allowed in any of the shops I've ever run, based on my opinions. I mean, I've always been quite skeptical about customer fronting technology unless it delivers really clear, obvious benefits, like speeds up a transaction or genuinely helps and supports customers in finding what they're looking for, whatever that is. Just hate the idea of taking input. As you said quite rightly, that we've spent decades sorting out, confectionery on checkouts, in aisle confectionery, removing pester power, taking things off bottom shelves, doing all the things that you would hope responsible retailers would do. in order for a big confectionery brand to come back in with something like this. So it's a bit of a thumbs down from me. You can probably tell.
This is the last thing I need, because I'm such a sugar addict anyway. And as you say, Julia, I need one chasing me around with some fruit and veg in to make sure I'm getting that in my basket, let alone chocolate. The only other execution I thought for this is hospitality and maybe, big sporting events and that sort of thing. It'll need to be able to get up and down steps. That's the only challenge. But when you're thinking about particularly the Americans and you're having your hot dog whilst you're watching the baseball, American football, this is perfect. And I guess would a robot be easier for those sort of things rather than having people in that game? But yeah, I don't need anything chasing me around with chocolate. I'll be in major trouble.
Laura, tell us about your second pick.
My second pick this week's from the BBC, and it's got the headline, "I'll buy 5 and only keep 1." And this is about clothes retailing online, and unsurprisingly, it's resonated with me, as I don't hide very well that going shopping's a bit of a hobby for me because I'm a retail geek and I like seeing what everybody's up to, not only in the food market but also in clothes retail. So the article talks about what's been happening. Unsurprisingly, we know the market's up by a third, and it gives some great examples of how people are buying more and more clothes online. And one of the sound bites in the article talks about boredom fueling online sales, and a lady quoted says, "I surf the John Lewis website like others surf the news sites," and I have to admit I really fall into that category. I think I'll just have a look and see what's on there. There's a talk about the 5 packages said headline and sending them back and actually not paying. So many of these retailers have free delivery, free returns, and yes, we're more likely to return online. I was surprised the stat in the article says about a third of the clothes bought online are returned. Sorry, a quarter of the clothes bought online are returned. I thought it'd be much higher than that, and that compares with in-store returns of around about 10%. There's also some good quotes from Mintel saying that the youngers try, buy and return, and they're saying that folks between about 16 and 34 have a 60% rate of more returns than other shoppers. I guess it's something I've noticed more recently, particularly over the last 12 months. It's harder to return stuff. Back in the day, you used to get a self-adhesive label and it was all easy. Now you need to go online for a lot of retailers and say what you're returning, print off the label yourself. So there's a few more barriers naturally put in there, and the article touches on this, particularly in the sustainability piece. So really interesting, and as I say, it does resonate with me. I have to admit, I've got a growing pile of parcels downstairs that I need to return to the post office at the weekend. I'm on first name terms with the lady at the post office counter on a Sunday afternoon. I think she pretty much hates me, but I don't know, where does this take us? And to your earlier point, Chris, at the beginning of the show about trends sticking, will we just get used to this, or will we realise, because of sustainability, because of carbon neutral and the push towards that for 2050, that we can't be just having stuff shipped to us all week and then returning it all on a weekend, and the big retailers are going to have to step up and put some barriers in place?
Yeah, so I think this is a trend which has been around for some time. So if anything, I think, definitely during pandemic it's been emphasized. However, talking to people in the fashion world prior to COVID, I think it's always been a major issue for them, and it's driven by a number of things. I mean, quite a lot of this is around the issue around size, and people just typically taking 3 sizes of the same garment as a way of just trying on. And obviously, if you've not got changing facilities and you're not in a shop, you can't do that. So it's just it's a genuine need for consumers, and the fact that there is no genuine standard sizing just means that it's difficult for you to know. So unless you're a regular shopper and you know exactly what your size is with that particular store or that particular brand, it's always going to be a problem. So that's definitely a problem. I think also, interestingly, as a retailer, whilst there is the obvious financial impact, and by the way, you're right, it is, certainly I'm pretty sure ASOS have been on record in the past saying that it can be up to 60% return, so it can go really, really high. There's a whole issue around the financial impact of just having to pay for the service effectively. Actually, the bigger issue, I think, for a lot of retailers is the inventory issue it causes and the process problems it drives. So from an inventory point of view, you're effectively allowed, it's removing the availability of that garment from your inventory for an indefinite amount of time, although constrained, by 20 days, 30 days, whatever the return period is. But in essence, you've no idea when it's going to come back in. And it's only then that you are able to put it back into the system and have any hope of reselling it. And I once spent a fascinating afternoon with Simon Wolfson at Next, shadowing him when he literally process mapped all their returns at Next. This was a good 10 years ago. And his point was he wanted someone to be able to buy online, return into a small Next store somewhere that didn't stock the product, and for that product to appear back into the mainstream Next inventory that would then be effectively available within a large Next store that did stock the product within like 3 days. And how can we do this? And it was really, process mapping the whole thing and really getting into it. And I think, that's all. The business issue is massive for fashion. And this year, particularly, given that everyone sat on huge amounts of inventory and huge amounts of unsold product, will just mean that it will get worse and worse. And from a trend point of view, I just don't see it improving. As you say, I think the only way of managing it is to bring in more and more barriers, make it more difficult. But ultimately, the only way of genuinely sorting it out is a combination of standardizing sizes and then finding ways of demonstrating the product online well enough that people can make those decisions online and believe in them and not have to return.
I thought it was so interesting what you were saying about finding technology perhaps that can help demonstrate how garments actually fit alongside greater standardization. I was interested to see that Snap, the parent company of Snapchat, they've just acquired a startup that specializes in sort of virtual reality, augmented reality, trying on technology essentially that tries to do exactly that. And as Snapchat, which obviously has a history and a lot of expertise around augmented and virtual reality lenses, as they're pushing further into e-commerce, they've clearly identified this as one of the pain points that they're potentially in a position to solve. So I'll be very interested to see what they actually do with that and how they deploy that, because I think if you can get that technology to be reliable and actually work and actually help you make better decisions in terms of sizing and fit, I think that could be a game changer.
I agree. I think the augmented reality is an obvious route out, and I think they're the sorts of things that are going to have to change.
Chris, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being our guest.
My pleasure. It's been really interesting. Thank you both. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.